and welcome to the Emergency Management Conference, Dr. Tim Neale. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning, Craig. Thank you for having me. Very jealous of your jacket, by the way, Craig. You're looking very sharp today. So I will hopefully be sharing my screen by now. I'd like to begin, of course, by acknowledging that I'm beaming to you today from beautiful Wurundjeri country here in Naarm, Melbourne, where I've got a bit of glare out the window. Moments ago it was cloudy, so forgive me the glare that I'm giving you all. I'd also like to, apart from acknowledging that I'm coming to you today from Wurundjeri land, and acknowledge the traditional owners and their hospitality, but also thank the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre and the Emergency Services Foundation for the invitation to present this research to you today. There's a long list of people who have collaborated in this research. The research is particularly based in the project that Craig mentioned, the Hazards, Culture and Indigenous Communities project, which has involved a number of literature reviews, interviews with over 50 practitioners engaged in collaborative natural hazards management, field work over the past 4 years, and many, many conversations. So there's a long list of names for me to acknowledge, and I can't fit it all in this time because I don't have a lot of time. So let's get to this. Before I begin, 3 quick caveats about what I'm going to say. It's important to understand here that the focus is on agencies in Southern Australia and the interface between agencies and Indigenous communities. It's not about what Indigenous communities think or should do. I do not speak about that, nor would I presume to. Further to that, I don't want anyone to have the impression that I think Indigenous peoples must work with agencies, as some may simply not want to. But Indigenous peoples do work with agencies in many contexts, and so there's therefore a need to kind of understand, again, this interface, where people meet and how it's changing. Third, you'll notice this presentation has a very fiery flavor, and that's because our research, while it began with an all hazards approach, we found very quickly that bushfire management was where the action was in terms of collaboration and partnership. It's where the interest was, and it's where that interface was most generative. Those are my 3 caveats. Here are my 2 key messages for you to take away. First, there has been and remains a lot of buzz about the potential for collaboration and partnership, but limited information on what is actually being done, what pathways to pursue, what information we have suggests that there has been limited action by agencies. There's buzz and good feeling, but comparatively less action. Second, individuals are really driven in this space. People get involved because it enriches their lives, and I want people to come away from this presentation with the sense that partnership and collaboration is exciting. It really, it changed, you know, a lot of our interviews people talk about how it changes their lives, agency people, I mean. But there's not a lot of clarity in the sector regarding why or how agencies should collaborate. So there's a need for principles, funding, and coordination to create substantial change. So that's enough of a preamble, and this is not a presentation about me, but it's polite to let you know a little bit about where I'm coming from. Thanks to Craig for the excellent introduction. I'm an academic, in case it isn't patently obvious, originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I've been here in Australia for 10 years. I've written some books, as you can see on that slide, so you know I'm an academic. But possibly relevant here is my own background in research that for a long time has specialized in interfaces between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, interfaces where alliances are worked out, formed, tensions and bonds and collaborations are worked through. And this work is being funded by, supported by the CRC and the ARC. So a couple of models to kind of get our thinking going here on a Tuesday morning for thinking about collaboration and partnership. Participation is a key word in the natural hazards sector, amongst many other public sectors. We want communities to participate in the management of environments and their hazards, and this is kind of underpinning a lot of our thinking, including about things like shared responsibility. A lot of our thinking about participation actually comes from civic movements in the 60s and 70s, particularly around urban planning, that sought to kind of wrest power from established groups like the upper echelons of government and place it in the hands of those with the most at stake, often community councils, community cooperatives. Many, if not all of you, will have encountered Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation, which is on the slide there, and its moral message, which is that participation should be about climbing this ladder. You know, it's kind of a linear trajectory. Up we go, and get further and further towards citizen control. I've found that in terms of understanding agencies and their engagements with Indigenous communities, it's often been framed as agencies frame their engagements with other communities, largely as a kind of step 2 to 3 kind of zone, trying to move towards up the ladder again to step 4, maybe 5, turning the interface between agencies and others into something more dialogical, characterized not just by messaging, but also by listening. While Arnstein's ladder is a classic, hard to go past, it's not the only model, and it's not the only useful model for thinking about how to conceptualize what's happening right now in terms of agencies and Indigenous communities. In fact, something I've been thinking about is thinking about instead relations in a continuum, where we have different engagements at different points, and this allows us to better understand where one another stands, what the overall composition of stakeholders, colleagues, partners, and authorities is that we want. And I started thinking about this in conversation with Indigenous peoples in particular involved in these projects, because the agencies present themselves, natural hazards management agencies, present themselves as authorities, but they're seen by Indigenous peoples often really as stakeholders. And agencies often deal with Indigenous peoples as stakeholders, even though they see themselves as authorities. So this is a kind of continuum to help us think about, well, where do we want to be? Where are things heading? And my own suggestion would be that things are heading towards a shared model of partners and authorities, where Indigenous peoples and agencies are both. So a little bit of modeling to get us going in the morning. Second, we did a review of all the Kansas countries, Canada, Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the United States, countries that are often paired together because of their similar histories. And we looked at over 350 pieces of academic literature to figure out, well, how do these relationships begin? And we saw that often they begin in Indigenous people's legal rights, that legal rights are recognized and then agencies kind of have to respond because they're legally obliged to. Sometimes they begin in governments themselves just without legal reasons, having policies and regulations. Sometimes there are local initiatives, and sometimes things come from hazard events. But these origins of where we begin relating lead to frameworks of how Indigenous peoples are framed. And most often, Indigenous peoples are still framed as stakeholder residents, just like any other community. Perhaps they're stakeholders who have particular vulnerabilities or particular exposures to hazards. And we are seeing more and more Indigenous peoples framed as experts about particular things, like intercultural matters. That is, Indigenous peoples are engaged in order to provide expertise on how to engage with Indigenous peoples, and sometimes experts on cultural heritage. But thinking again with a continuum from the previous slide, in what context are Indigenous peoples framed as having authority about hazards in the way that emergency management agency is? And that's, I guess, where I feel like the sector's thinking is beginning to go. So having posed these kind of big models and big questions, let me quickly review what our research has shown about the popular policy and agency context that are shaping collaboration and partnership. 2020 has seen a peak of interest in Indigenous fire management, as people will be well aware, but this isn't an isolated phenomenon. We have over the last decade seen a lot of growth of interest in Indigenous peoples' millennia of care for country, the acceptance of agreement making as a preferred method for addressing Indigenous interests, and Indigenous heritage, cultural heritage, as a primary goal of land management. All that said, in various spheres of life, we see there's still kind of uncertain support for actual Indigenous control, whether we're thinking about mining, community health, criminal justice sector. So enthusiasm for knowledge and heritage, uncertain support for actual control. And what this, how I've come to understand this and analyze this is through a framework from a North American Indigenous scholar, Kyle Powers-White, Potawatomi scholar at the University of Michigan. And Powers-White talks about, well, when we're thinking about how we value Indigenous things, Indigenous knowledge, let's say, we need to think about, well, what are we valuing? And he talks about the difference between supplementary value and governance value. And his point is that often when non-Indigenous people approach Indigenous issues, they look for what can this person, this traditional knowledge, do to help me with my problem. Rather, as Powers-White points out, we should be thinking about how can this problem actually strengthen the governance of those people? How can our collective solution, how is it an opportunity to change things, to build governance? In terms of the policy context, a lot to run through, but as people will probably be well aware, internationally and nationally over the past decade or more, we've seen the growth of kind of recognition that there need to be of this idea of partnerships, local self-determination, people are consenting. In the emergency management sector, these kinds of policy statements like those I put up here that speak very much about acknowledging Indigenous fire use, for example, or looking for opportunities to employ Indigenous peoples. And I would say the overall kind of policy context is one that has talked a lot about promoting, supporting, and acknowledging these kind of quite big symbolic kind of issues and symbolism, you know, very important. As a humanities person, I'm not going to be mean about symbolism. But what we realize now, and this is very clear this year in relationship to what's coming out of the various inquiries into the recent bushfire season, is we actually have very little targets or monitoring or evaluation of the interface between Indigenous communities and agencies. That there's a lot of support, a lot of acknowledgement, but very little actual data and you know, performance indicators. In terms of actual agencies, we've seen the proliferation recently of strategies and plans, notable growth in kind of guidelines. Although these guidelines and plans, it should be noted, often lack kind of talk about implementation, resources towards implementation. So we've got a growth of strategies and plans, which is great. We've got widespread enthusiasm, but still on the implementation side, we're still kind of lacking. And this is signaled in the continued underrepresentation of Indigenous peoples within the sector. A lot of agencies, we did a review, and a lot of agencies, it turns out, do not actually even collect data about the number of Indigenous employees they have. And from our interviews, continued everyday and structural racism that people encounter. So everyday, this might be everyday minor things, perceived lack of respect or use of racist concepts or racist language, or a lack of actual support for cultural diversity, which is what we would call structural racism. So I realize I'm plowing through my time, so I just want to talk quickly about the roadblocks and enablers that we found in relationship to actual partnerships. The top two roadblocks, you could probably predict this, that we live in financially constrained environments with a lot to achieve, and agencies come to the table with the regulatory authority, the budget, the resources. Things in life tend to happen on the terms of those who hold the money and write the agenda. And currently, a lot of these partnerships, they just kind of lack ongoing funding and therefore equity for the partners. Things happen on the terms of agencies and less so on the terms of Indigenous partners. And then, of course, regulations. When you're trying to do something that doesn't have institutional processes already established, and institutions that are not all that pliable, doing something new or that may seem simple actually has big implications for immovable objects like acts and codes. So these are the kind of big major roadblocks amongst others. Lack of institutional support, so we often see things happening at the grassroots that may not have support from the central office, or things that have support from the central office that don't have support at the grassroots. So these are other roadblocks. In terms of enablers, again, this is probably familiar to people from other parts of the sector. One of the top enablers, interpersonal trust. There are a lot of reasons for Indigenous peoples not to trust agencies. Agencies are part of government, and government is part of a system of dispossession for many Indigenous peoples. So you need to build trust in order to negotiate many uncertainties, the bumps in the road, the moments of having to make do and muddle through. You also need to resource for actual relation building. You can't just have relations between one person and another person, one person from an agency and one person from an Indigenous community, because institutionally you're still therefore involved in consultation mode. You're not building resilient partnerships with networks of individuals. So you need to have time and space for getting to know one another across multiple levels of an agency. And then other things there, obviously, if you can have income streams from enterprises that relate to these partnerships, then that's great. Legal agreements to help you work through difficulties, things like that. So what next? Here's the vision bit. What next is we need to go beyond stakeholders. Talking about partnerships, I know can be freaky, can freak people out, sounds difficult and risky. There's no guidebook, there's no guarantees, but it's a necessary change and it's what's happening. And agencies can choose to drag their feet, or they can be active in moving beyond the stakeholder model. Two, we need to move beyond supplementary value. This is the idea I flagged before. Prioritize governance and governance benefit. That partnerships and collaborations are not here to just help agencies, they're here to build partnerships, build strong partners. Third, moving beyond support. So we need statements of support and a necessary symbolism, but there's symbolism still, and what is being done to strengthen partners and authorities? What lessons are transferable across contexts? How do we know about it? Is it being resourced to give people confidence into the future? So we need to create a context of accountability and coordination. One fear that we came across again and again in this research is that people feel they can't make mistakes when they're doing these traditional fire management, let's say, partnerships. Because partnership is in many ways optional for agencies, and the fear is that agencies will walk away from projects or programs when the funding runs out. And that's a terrible way to try and build trust. So that's it for my time. If you have any questions, I realize I went very quickly. If you have any questions or would like to follow up, my contact details are there. You can also look up the project website. We've got lots of publications in there, lots of presentations, things for you to read, but happy to have follow-up conversations with anybody who is interested. And I'd also like to acknowledge the beautiful photo there from the Dungala Fire Workshop last year in 2019, when we were all allowed to be socially proximate. And a welcome to Yorta Yorta country from Ralph Hume, Chris Hume, and other Yorta Yorta traditional owners. We'll get back there someday soon. I'm looking forward to it. And that's my time, I think.
Good on you, Tim. Thank you. Really enjoyed that. One of the questions here on the screen talks about the Indigenous engagement processes. Are they different in the different jurisdictions of the country?
Are they different in different parts of the country? Yes, absolutely. Like, things have to, I guess, be tuned to local circumstance. And, there'll be different parts of the country where, for example, let's say here in Victoria, there are parts of the country, there are parts of the state that have recognised Aboriginal parties. So these are corporate groups who have been recognised by the state as having traditional authority for country. But there are parts of Victoria that, for reasons of the kind of I guess the immense impacts of colonisation, mean that it's not necessarily obvious who you're supposed to talk to. It may be that you have to talk to a range of people, a range of organisations, in order to really be engaging with the Indigenous community. So I think it's hence this kind of interest, I think, in having principles of partners, principles of equity, that then can be tuned to a local context.
And in terms of having a greater presence of Indigenous Australians in those senior leadership positions, in policy positions, where greater influence can be exerted. Is that sort of within the broad scope of your focus?
It's come up as an issue from our research, and it's something I would really like to do more work on. We have studies from other parts of the public sector in Australia that suggest, that there are certain challenges and tensions to being an Indigenous person within government. Maybe, for example, that a feeling to a need to be critical, a feeling of divided, of multiple interests. And I think the emergency management sector definitely has some amazing programs and Indigenous leadership. But I think we need to find out more from those people about what led to their commitment to the sector, how they managed to maintain their position within the sector over time, how their careers developed. We know this for other parts of the public sector, but I think it would be very interesting to look more at emergency management and where there have been successes.
Tim, I've got a question here from Sharon Nunn from Metro Trains. Hello, Sharon. She attended the conference last year where an Aboriginal elder was discussing the loss of knowledge in this space within the younger generation, and she's interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, I don't know the context that Sharon's speaking about, but thank you for the question, Sharon. I think this is something that comes up a lot, and it goes back to what I was saying before about I think often when non-Indigenous peoples engage with Indigenous peoples, they look for the knowledge. What do you know that can help me? And what Indigenous peoples know, they may not want to share because they may not trust the person that they're speaking to. And so while knowledge is really important, it shouldn't be the basis of why we're engaging. Why we're engaging is because Indigenous peoples are first peoples for country and they have a right to be engaged. In terms of generational issues, that's definitely come up in our case studies. And I think things like cultural burns are embraced and people have so much enthusiasm because they are this really great opportunity for the passage of knowledge and bonding between different generations. That cultural burns or other cultural events, let's say, other things relating to cultural heritage are real occasions for people to gather, for people to talk about story, to people to talk about country that they may not have otherwise because that's not what they have jobs, they have other occupations, and these things are really vital to support that intergenerational bonding for sure.